The strangest relic in Silo may have just become even more important. For 3 seasons, that little duck Pez dispenser has looked almost ridiculous compared with everything else happening in this story. People are dying, silos are being poisoned, the algorithm is controlling entire populations. And yet, this tiny piece of candy memorabilia keeps coming back. George Wilkins had it. Juliette eventually received it. And now we know where it came from. Season 2 ended by showing Daniel giving the exact same Pez dispenser to Helen in the before times. At first, it looked like a clever way to connect the two timelines. Then Season 3 started giving us more information about Helen, Daniel, relics, and memory. By episode 6, the show confirmed something even more direct. Helen had been the owner of the Pez dispenser before the Silo era. And by episode 8, we learned that Helen and Daniel had been brought directly into the project that would create the 50 silos. That leaves one huge question. Could Helen have been one of the original Flamekeepers? Because if she was, the Pez dispenser may have survived for centuries for a very specific reason. The first piece of this puzzle is the Flamekeepers themselves. Back in Season 1, Gloria Hildebrandt explained that the Flamekeepers were people who preserved memories of the world before the silo. They kept forbidden knowledge alive through stories and relics. The system tried to erase that history, while the Flamekeepers tried to preserve it. That distinction becomes much more interesting now that we have met Helen. Helen was already doing something remarkably similar before the silos existed. She was a journalist investigating information powerful people wanted buried. She was willing to protect sources. She was willing to challenge Daniel about the dirty bomb and the possibility that the official story surrounding Iran was wrong. Then she was taken to the construction site and shown what was really being planned. 50 Silos, a project designed to preserve humanity after a nanotechnology catastrophe. And Helen rejected it. That decision matters, because the woman who had spent her life trying to uncover suppressed information was suddenly being offered a place inside the biggest secret humanity had ever created. She could have become part of the project. Instead, she chose to leave. Daniel went with her. At that point, it would be easy to assume the Pez mystery has been solved. Daniel bought it. He gave it to Helen. Somehow, centuries later, it ended up with George. But the show's obsession with relics gives that object another layer. In Season 3, Episode 5, Juliette's memories were restored after she handled the Pez dispenser. The object had become tied to a specific memory, and that memory contained information that could potentially save Silo 18. That is a huge clue about why relics were so dangerous. The algorithm didn't merely have to control what people were told. It had to control what they remembered. A physical object could interfere with that. The Pez dispenser was connected to George. George was connected to the secrets underneath Silo 18. Those secrets were connected to Juliette's investigation. And when Juliette touched the Pez again, memories that had been suppressed came back. So what happens if Helen eventually enters a silo carrying that same object? She could become one of the first people to understand what the system was doing, and that is where the Flamekeeper theory gets much stronger. We already know that the Flamekeepers existed in Silo 18 long before Juliette discovered them. Gloria belonged to the group, and Wilkins was connected to them. George inherited relics through his family. The Pez could therefore be part of a completely different chain of inheritance. Helen receives it before the silos. Helen potentially enters the silo system. The object survives. Generations pass. Eventually, it reaches George. Then George gives it to Juliette. That would mean the Pez wasn't simply a random relic that survived hundreds of years. It could have been deliberately preserved by people who understood what it meant. And there is one detail that makes this theory especially interesting. Helen wasn't handed the Pez by some mysterious rebel. Daniel gave it to her. He bought it as a casual gift because of her connection to the University of Oregon and its duck mascot. At the time, there was no reason for either of them to think this tiny object would matter. But that is exactly the kind of object Silo keeps turning into history. Something ordinary becomes evidence. Something personal becomes forbidden. Something that looks meaningless becomes a trigger for remembering the truth. The Pez may have been Helen's personal connection to Daniel before it became a relic of the old world. And if Helen eventually became one of the first people to preserve forbidden memories inside a silo, the object could have become a symbol of that resistance. There is another possibility, though. Maybe Helen wasn't the original Flamekeeper at all. Maybe she was the person who started the chain. That distinction could matter a lot. The Flamekeepers we met in Season 1 weren't simply people who possessed old objects. They were part of a tradition. Information was passed from one generation to another. Relics moved between families. People were taught that remembering the past mattered. Helen wouldn't have needed to invent the entire organization herself. She may have simply become one of its earliest members. And if that happened, the Pez could have been one of the first objects they deliberately protected. That would give George's story an entirely different meaning. George wasn't just a guy who happened to find an interesting relic. He was part of a family history that may have stretched all the way back to the before times. His mother, Anne, was a Flamekeeper. His Aunt Gloria was connected to the same tradition. And George eventually became the person who gave the Pez to Juliette. The object therefore moves through the exact kind of chain the Flamekeepers were designed to create. One person remembers. They pass something on. The next person remembers. Then another generation does the same thing. Until eventually, Juliette receives it. And Juliette is the person who finally uses that memory to fight back against the system. That feels very deliberate. But Season 3, Episode 8 gives us one problem with the theory. Helen and Daniel currently seem to be leaving the Silo project entirely. They were offered positions inside Stenson's operation. Daniel was offered a role connected to engineering. Helen was offered the chance to become the journalist who would eventually reveal the Silo project to the world. They both refuse. So, how does Helen get into a silo? That is the missing piece. And I think the answer could be hidden in what happens next. There is a strange irony in Helen's decision to walk away from the Silo project. She refuses to become part of the system when she first sees it. If the Flamekeeper theory is correct, she may eventually become part of that system anyway, only from the opposite side. That would give Helen's character a very clean progression. She begins as a journalist trying to expose a hidden political story. Then she discovers the truth about nanotechnology and the silos. Then she realizes the people building the silos intend to control who gets to know that truth. And eventually, if she enters one of those silos, she would have to watch that history disappear. That would make the Flamekeepers almost inevitable, because somebody had to remember. The people inside the silos were eventually told almost nothing about the world they came from. Their memories were suppressed, relics were outlawed, stories about the past became dangerous. A person like Helen would have been almost perfectly suited to resist that. She already had the instinct. Investigate, question, preserve information, protect the source. That is basically the same behavior the Flamekeepers displayed generations later. And this is where the Pez becomes more than a family heirloom. It could have been a memory anchor. Season 3 has made the relationship between physical objects and memory much clearer. Juliette's recovery in Episode 5 is the strongest example. She handled objects connected to her past, but the Pez was the one that finally broke through. That means the algorithm had a very good reason to fear relics. A relic could contain no information by itself. The object could simply be a watch, a book, or a Pez dispenser. The danger was what the object could make a person remember. That makes the Flamekeepers' behavior much easier to understand. They weren't merely collecting antiques. They were protecting triggers for memories that the silo system wanted erased. And suddenly the Pez's journey looks almost suspiciously perfect. Helen has it before the silos. Someone carries it into the new world. It survives the destruction of the old civilization. It is passed down through people connected to the Flamekeepers. George eventually gets it. George understands that relics matter. He gives the Pez to Juliette. And Juliette uses it to recover information that could save an entire silo. That is one continuous chain. The show has spent years showing us the final link before finally revealing the beginning. There is also something interesting about George specifically. George was fascinated by the hidden history of Silo 18. He had already discovered information that the authorities wanted buried, and he understood that relics could contain clues about the past. His family connection makes that even more meaningful. George inherited the Georgia travel book through his mother and the Flamekeepers. That relic carried memories of the world outside. The Pez came from a completely different path, yet it eventually entered the same collection. That suggests George may have been gathering pieces of a history that had been scattered across generations. And Juliette became the person who finally connected them. That could be why the Pez keeps appearing whenever the show wants to connect the before times with Silo 18. It is the cleanest physical bridge between the two timelines. There is another possibility I find even more interesting. Helen may have been a Flamekeeper without ever realizing what the group would become. The organization could have developed after the silos were established. Helen may have simply carried the first piece of forbidden history into the new world. Someone else could have recognized its importance. Then the tradition grew around people like her. In that version, Helen isn't necessarily the founder, she's the source. And that might explain why the show has been so careful with her character. She isn't a random historical figure introduced to give Daniel somebody to talk to. She is a journalist whose entire personality revolves around discovering information that powerful institutions want hidden. Then the show gives her the Pez. Then it reveals the Flamekeepers. Then it reveals the memory effects of Relics. Then it reveals the true purpose of the silos. Those pieces are starting to point in the same direction. There is still a major question about the timeline, though. The Pez has survived for centuries. That requires more than Helen simply owning it. Someone had to protect it, someone had to pass it on, and someone had to understand that it mattered. That is where the Flamekeepers fit almost perfectly. Maybe the first generation preserved the objects because they remembered the old world. Their children inherited the objects without fully understanding them. Their grandchildren turned them into family secrets. Eventually, the original meaning became distorted. The object became a relic. The memory became a story. The story became a forbidden tradition. And then Juliette came along and discovered that the old stories were real. That would explain why the Flamekeepers were so dangerous to the Silo authorities. You can erase history from a textbook. You can destroy records. You can control the information on the screens. But an object sitting in someone's hand can bring the past back. The Pez proved that. And Juliette's memory recovery may be the show's biggest demonstration of why the Flamekeepers mattered. They kept enough pieces of the old world alive for someone in the future to recover the truth. So, is Helen the original Flamekeeper? Right now, we don't have enough evidence to call that confirmed. What we can say is much more interesting. Helen is the first known owner of the Pez. She was already investigating the forces that would eventually create the silo system. She rejected the invitation to become part of that system. And the same object she received from Daniel eventually became one of the most important relics in Silo 18. The next question is what happened to Helen after she walked away, because Episode 8 leaves Daniel and Helen outside the Silo project, at least for the moment. Episode 9 is titled Farewell, and the official episode information says Daniel and Helen will attend a special event. That could be important. If Helen is going to become part of the origin of the Flamekeepers, the show has to explain how she gets from the woman who rejected the Silo project to the woman whose relic survives inside one. And there is a beautiful possibility sitting in the middle of all of this. Maybe the Flamekeepers didn't begin with people who wanted to rebel. Maybe they began with people who simply refused to forget. Helen already had that instinct. The Pez was already in her hands. And centuries later, Juliette held that same object and remembered exactly what the system wanted her to forget. That makes the Pez mystery feel much bigger than a clever connection between two timelines. It may be the story of how one memory survived.